Hey everyone, this is Miss Valentine, and this is the Risk Toxicology and Human Health Notes for AP Environmental Science. Let's define what risk is. And in environmental science, it may take a different form than what we usually think of. The risk involved in any sort of action or any sort of hazard is just the possibility of suffering harm. So that might sound familiar to you in your own terms of risk. A hazard is just anything that can cause injury, disease, economic loss, or environmental damage. So it looks different depending on the context that you're looking at it in, but really it's just the possibility of suffering in some way. Probability is something you probably heard about in biology class and genetics, and then possibly in math as well. And probability is just how likely it is that some event or effect is going to occur. The equation you see on the right is just one equation of probability, seeing what event is likely to happen and what are the other possible outcomes. So it can range from a zero, which means no risk. So if the outcome is not likely to happen at all, to a one, which is the absolute certainty of risk. And if you think of that in terms of a percentage, it'd be like 0% versus 100%. So the level of certainty can be expressed as either just a number or as a percentage. It kind of helps to think about it, I think, more as a percentage, even if you do see it as just a number. Risk is defined as the probability of exposure times the probability of harm. So this is the more environmental science oriented definition of risk. So it's the exposure or the amount of times you are exposed to something or the amount of quantity that you're exposed to something times the harm that could result as a result of that hazard. So that is risk defined in terms of what we'll be seeing in environmental science. A risk assessment is one that is an assessment or a test where you use data and evidence to estimate the probability that harm will occur. So again, you're kind of using one of the formulas, there's actually a few formulas of probability to see if something is going to cause harm related to a certain hazard. So it really is a multi-step process. The risk assessment is you start by identifying real or potential hazards, determine the probability of those hazards happening, and then assess the severity that those hazards could have on health, environment, economy, or the social impact of those hazards. So it all depends on the context of what you're looking at, whether it's making a risk assessment about your electric grid and whether it can handle certain hazards versus the location of a certain coal mine and the amount of possible pollution that could happen. So there's all sorts of different environmental circumstances where you might want to do a risk assessment before you decide to invest in a certain action that could involve a hazard. Risk management, here's our all-star of the year, Dr. Anthony Fauci from the National Institutes of Health. He is involved in a lot of risk management, especially right now, but he has been his entire career. But you decide what risks face society, and then you try to manage them. That's all risk management is. Part of that involves is deciding how reliable the risk assessment is that was originally made, and then decide how much of risk is acceptable given the other societal conditions that come into play. So in the case of the coronavirus pandemic, it has been about how much risk to the economy is there for taking these health measures, and then how much risk to our health is there compared to our economic. So there's a balance of how much risk you're willing to take in different areas, considering the risk in other areas as well. So risk management also involves deciding how much money is needed to reduce the risk. If the funds are not available, then what? And then how do you communicate a plan to the public? All of those things are important when you're trying to manage the risk of something taking place. Even other situations, not just public health examples are a good one, but you also need to discuss energy production and pollution and other types of issues related to society and the environment. Here we are at our first pit stop. What is the difference between risk assessment and risk management, and how are they related? Pause the video while you answer the question. There are many different types of hazards that we may face in all different categories. So there's cultural hazards, things like drugs, drinking, unsafe sex, smoking, working conditions, poverty, racism, sexism, and even social media addiction. Those are all things that culturally can be hazardous to our health. The chemical hazards in the environment are some that we're more familiar with because we're always worried about chemical pollution. But there's also harmful chemicals in our consumer products as well that aren't very well regulated. So being aware of those is actually something that is on the consumers to do rather than on governments and product makers to tell us. There are also physical hazards like natural disasters, radiation, wildfires, earthquakes, and flooding, and then biological hazards, which are pathogens, pollen, and animals. And you can see in the picture there, our more famous biological hazard of recent times is the coronavirus, which is just one type of pathogen of many that are out there. So there are many different hazards that we look at when we're trying to do risk assessments and risk management. Toxicology is the study of adverse effects of chemicals on an individual's health. So this is looking at toxic substances. Toxicity is just a measure of how harmful a substance is. And again, toxicology is the study of those harmful substances. The dose is the amount of a substance that one is exposed to. And there's other questions that go along with it, like how does that substance get into the body? Is it inhaled, injected, absorbed, or ingested? And all of those can impact how harmful that substance is to that individual. So studying all of the different ways that a material can get into the bloodstream and into the cells is also important. The response is the resulting type or amount of damage to health given a certain dose. So we'll look at dose response curves in just a moment here. So a response is just whatever damage might happen or whatever response you get after a certain dose of a material. And it depends on a lot of things. So the size of the dosage is a major factor. One of the most important factors is how much you are exposed to. How often the exposure occurs. So, are you getting it in a repeated circumstances, or are you just exposed once? So, the frequency of it is the exposure. Who is exposed? So, what is the person's age, body size, their underlying health conditions? So, that has played a significant role in our recent coronavirus pandemic. Is age, body size, and underlying health conditions have all made a difference, but that can apply to a lot of different other substances as well. And then how well the body's systems detoxify materials. So the liver is a major detoxifying organ. The lungs and the kidneys also play a role. So how well those are functioning can determine the response or the damage that can take place as a result of exposure to a hazard. But wait, there's more. The response can also depend on a person's genetic makeup that determines their sensitivity to a particular toxin. This picture on the right here is showing someone's sensitive skin. So some people have really sensitive skin that responds badly to a lot of chemicals in commercial products. And then also solubility. If you remember from chemistry class, that's does something dissolve into water? And if it does, it can get into the water supply and then more easily get into us and into our cells and the cells of other living things. So what you see on the right there is DDT supplies. DDT is something that was uh, very popular in the 1950s and 60s as a pesticide, and we found that it was in our water supply and it had a long existence or persistence in the environment. So it has been banned in the United States, but it still gets used in other parts of the world. So persistence, though, is how long something stays into the environment. And if you have something that's very persistent and stays for a long time, it increases the amount of exposure that an individual will get. There are variations in sensitivity naturally to most hazards. So this is showing the dose along the x-axis here. As you increase the dosage, you may have people that are sensitive in the outer ranges, but most of the population is not very sensitive to certain chemicals. So a lot of times the data that you observe or that you get as a consumer is based on the majority of the population, but there is always outliers, people that are very sensitive to certain doses. There are two different terms that we use to describe short-term versus long-term health effects. The word acute just means Short term, it's an immediate reaction. So, an acute infection would be something that just happens really quickly and it usually doesn't last very long. If you have dizziness or a rash, usually that's a short term thing that doesn't stay around. A chronic effect is something that is more permanent or long lasting. So you often hear the term chronic disease, and that's something that you have your entire life. It's a long term condition. So you have lifelong health conditions like emphysema or COPC, those are associated with the lungs. Those are chronic conditions or chronic diseases. Liver or kidney damage can also be another long term permanent uh, health condition that can affect your health for a very long time. All right, here we are at our next pit stop. What are four of the seven factors that determine the amount of damage that is caused by a toxic substance? Please pause the video while you answer the question. Bioaccumulation is a term that might be familiar from biology class. The other one that goes with it is biomagnification. And in biology class, we kind of teach it as they're kind of the same thing. They go along together. In this class, we'll be a little bit more specific with that. So, bioaccumulation is just an increase in the concentration of a chemical or the accumulation of a chemical in specific organs or tissues at a higher level than is normally expected in an organism. So, this is showing a picture of a shark with bioaccumulation of heavy metals, but it happens in other organisms as well, including humans. We are at the top of the food chain, so we are also susceptible to bioaccumulation. So anything that's water soluble is usually excreted with urine. So it doesn't accumulate in your tissues, you just pee it out. Oil or fat soluble toxins actually accumulate in fat deposits. If you remember polar versus non-polar, polar things attract polar things, non-polar or oil and fat soluble things attract fat deposits or other non-polar materials. And they can actually stay in the body for a very long time. So they have a long residence time, and that is how they accumulate in the tissues. So they can eventually be flushed out, but it takes a very long time because you have two nonpolar molecules being attracted to one another. So, biomagnification, on the other hand, is taking it a step further from the individual organism. Bioaccumulation is the toxins building up in an individual organism. Biomagnification is talking about how those toxins are magnified as you pass through the food chain. Because a small fish that has those toxins gets eaten by a bigger fish. And so, this bigger fish has to eat lots of these little ones to survive. That's a pretty little guppy. Why would he want to eat them? Anyway, they have to eat a lot of fish to survive, so they build up more of those toxin. And then this guy's got to eat a ton of these guys to get all the food he needs. And so he obtains all of those toxins. So that's how it magnifies. It's an increase in the concentration of a pollutant as you move up the food chain. So DDT, like I mentioned a few slides back, is a very persistent one that is stored in body fat, and it it affects organisms during gestation or egg laying, and during the nursing stages. Bald eagles were on the endangered species list for a very long time as a result of DDT being used as a pesticide. Their eggs were very thin, the shells did not fully form, and so bald eagles had a very devastating uh, effect, or they experienced devastating effects from the use of DDT. Since we have banned DDT, though, eagles have been taken off the endangered species list, and you can even see them in Westerville. Here's a picture, might be different than the one that you have in your notes, but it's showing the biomagnification, how you start with very small fish and organisms, and they accumulate some of the toxins. But because these bigger fish have to eat a lot of these littler fish, they accumulate all those toxins in their body fat. And then the higher up the food chain you go, like a bird that's eating this bigger fish, that is going to build up all of that toxin from those smaller fish that they're eating. So that's biomagnification. The bioaccumulation is the actual accumulation of the toxins in the tissue of the organism. Which, there we go. We're at our next pit stop. What is the difference between bioaccumulation and biomagnification? Pause the video while you answer the question. Chemical reactions take place in our bodies all the time, in our cells. And how those interactions play out can depend on the things that we put into our body. So, this is a really relevant thing when you're dealing with medicine. And that's why I have a picture of the pills here. Your doctors care about whether or not the pills that you are taking are going to interact with one another in a harmful or in a positive way. So, chemical interactions can either decrease or multiply the harmful effects of a toxin. And we have two different terms for that. Antagonistic, think of an antagonist in English class. That's somebody who's working against the main character. So an antagonistic interaction is working against a harmful response. It's reducing the harmful response. A synergistic interaction multiplies the harmful effects. So synergy can often be thought of as like a good thing because it's increasing an effect, but synergistic interaction actually means it's making the harm more substantial. So when your doctor is asking what medications you take, they're asking because if the pill that they want to prescribe to you could have a synergistic effect, they don't want to prescribe that medication to you. So it's important to understand that the things that we do put into our bodies do interact with our bodies just the way our natural substances do in our cells. So, why should we care about all of this, about toxins and chemicals and biological hazards? Especially with chemical concentration or chemical substances, it depends on the amount that you have in your body. So you can have trace elements in your system, and it doesn't harm you at all. So in the case of like mercury or things that you might find in fish tissue, you can have a certain amount of that. You just don't want to go over the a certain quantity. So the term that you often hear, or the phrase that you often hear with this, is that the dose makes the poison. So the amount or the quantity that you have will make it poisonous if it's in a high enough quantity or amount. Most chemicals have a safe threshold level, which means you won't experience any harmful effects until you reach a certain level of concentration in your body. So, a lot of chemicals you can have a small exposure to. It's not going to cause damage unless you get a whole lot of exposure or a high dose of that substance. Poison is the name of a band from the 1980s who apparently went on tour in 2020. I'm not a big fan, but this was just an opportunity I couldn't pass up. Poison, in terms of environmental science, is a chemical with an LD50 of 50 milligrams or less per kilograms of body weight, which is like, what? What do you mean? So let me explain what LD50 is. It is a term that you are going to need to know for the AP Environmental Science exam. LD50, LD stands for lethal dose, and it's the median lethal dose. Remember, median is middle, so that's what the 50 is. It's 50%. So the LD50 or median lethal dose is the amount of chemical received in one dose that kills exactly 50% of test animals within a 14-day period, which is a very unfortunate way that we use to test the LD50 is by testing on animals. Generally, something that says it's not tested on animals, a product that says that, is not going to have toxic substances in it, or it's going to have things that are known not to be toxic, because you have to test the toxicity to be able to say something like it's safe or at certain levels. So anything that is free of animal testing is most likely free of poisons as well. How do we determine this toxicity since the chemicals are all different? Generally, if you're talking about humans, we look at case reports. So physicians will report any side effects or responses in patients to larger authorities like the CDC or the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. Most chemicals, if they are being tested, which not all are done on lab animals. And this picture here is kind of a cute one. You get that little obese mouse there. But if you Google lab testing on animals, you'll find a lot worse pictures of some of the things that result. Epidemiology, we hear the word epidemic and we usually think of a biological hazard, something like a virus and how it spreads. But epidemiology is really the study of how anything spreads or is concentrated throughout the population. So you can study a pathogen or a virus like the coronavirus as an epidemic, but you can also study lead poisoning as an epidemic as well, because it affects a large population of people. So epidemiology is really the study of populations and how their exposure to certain chemicals or diseases takes place. Here is a table that I believe I put on your notes packet showing the LD50 or the lethal dose, median lethal dose for different substances. So super toxic things, you need very small amount, zero point zero 0.01 milligrams per, or less than zero point zero 0.01 milligrams per 1 kilogram of body weight. And those are like nerve gases, botulism, dioxin, also a nerve gas. And then you have things that are pretty much non-toxic that are, you can get 15,000 milligrams per 1 kilogram of your body weight, and they're not going to harm you. So water makes sense. Table sugar, although I will say table sugar, they have found to be toxic in other ways. So you can see there's a wide range of toxicities, including things like caffeine right here, 50 to 500 means it can be toxic in a higher amount. So and then the much higher amounts are the non-toxic materials. A dose response curve is used to show what response you'll get at a certain dose. So this one is shown, the response is actually measuring death. It's a dose response curve itself is generated using acute or short-term toxicity tests that show the effect of a certain dose on the test organisms. So like I said, this is showing what dose will kill 50% of the organisms and 100% of the organisms. So it just shows the effect of the dose on death of the organism. Generally, in these types of tests where you're creating this dose response curve, you have a control group that's not exposed and a test group that is exposed. So it's usually a controlled experiment that generates these dose response curves. And the LD50, once again, is the lethal dose at which 50% of the organisms are killed. So that's where they get these LD50 numbers as well. Now, some dose response curves show that there is no safe dose. So that would be called a no threshold level substance. So no matter what the dose is, it's going to be harmful to you. This is the case for ionizing radiation, which is what you get when you have a nuclear plant meltdown, or chemicals that cause cancer or birth defects. They also have an effect no matter what the dose is. So you can see here, most substances fall in this area where you have a threshold level where over a certain amount is going to have a harmful effect. But no threshold level means that it's going to have a harmful effect no matter how much the dose is. All right, here we are at our pit stop. What is the LD50 for a particular substance? So what does LD50 mean? What is that indicating about a certain substance? Pause the video while you answer the question. All right, let's talk about some specific types of chemical substances that can cause damage in humans. The first is the term mutagens. And mutagens are just things that can cause mutations in DNA. And we're going to talk about some more specific types of mutagens. In reproductive cells, if you cause a mutation, you might remember from biology that that will then be passed on to future generations. So if it's a mutation in the sperm or egg cells, you end up having that trait being passed on. And that can actually be a good thing for evolution in the long term. Usually it's not good for an organism. In other cells, in body cells, it results in tumors, which could then be cancerous. It just depends on which part of the DNA sequence that the mutagen is affecting. So in most of these cases, a mutation is harmless. So our DNA has about 95% of the code that is completely nonsense. It doesn't code for any genes. And so if you have a mutation in this area that's completely nonsense, it doesn't really matter. And so that's why most mutations are harmless. But if you increase exposure over and over again to a mutagen, then it increases the chances that that 5% DNA, the one that actually codes for something, is going to be affected by it. And then whether or not that does have an effect, whether it's just a tumor or a dangerous cancer, that's all determined about where in the genetic code it happens. So there's lots of mutagens out there that we're being exposed to, like, for example, processed foods and preservatives. We eat hot dogs, we eat deli meat, and it doesn't normally affect us because you have to have a lot of exposure over a long time in order for that to build up and eventually will affect your DNA. Teratogens are things that harm babies in the womb. So they cause birth defects when the embryo is developing in pregnancy. What you're seeing there in that picture is called, I can't remember how to say this medication, thalidomide. Babies, it was thalidomide was a medication that was given to women as when they were pregnant to help with morning sickness. And then they discovered that these babies were being born without arms, sometimes without legs. And so they stopped using it. But just imagine like having a baby and finding out that you were taking this pill that harmed them. I can't even imagine how awful that had to be. But a teratogen is just something that harms a developing baby. Heavy metals like mercury, lead, and cadmium, arsenic are also dangerous, and that's why they tell women to be careful about what types of fish they eat when they're pregnant. When I was pregnant with my baby, I was not eating any like higher level, high on the food chain fish because they had a lot of bioaccumulation of mercury and other toxins in it. So there's lots of other things that can cause damage to developing embryos. So it's important to be aware of those, especially if you plan on having a baby. Carcinogens are anything that cause cancer. So, metastasis, sometimes you hear the term like it has metastasized. So, that's when it gets into your body fluids and gets to other parts of your body. So, hopefully, if you do get cancer, which 1 out of 3 people end up getting cancer in their lifetime, hopefully it does not metastasize and go to other parts of your body. That's usually when things are deadly. Major sources of carcinogen exposure, smoking is like basically you're just pumping carcinogens into your body constantly. And vaping is also a carcinogenic substance as well. So even though it has been promoted as better than smoking, it's definitely not carcinogen free. Diet. So, like I said, processed meats and foods, you have to limit your amount to those because too much will have a possibility of giving you cancer. Occupational exposure, that would be like if you're exposed to a certain chemical in your job. And then environmental pollutants. If you live near a power plant, for example, you might get exposed to carcinogens. Some cancer genes are inherited, like there is a gene for breast cancer that's inherited, but for the most part, carcinogens come from the environment. Unfortunately, it usually takes 10 to 40 years before people realize that they have even experienced any damage. So, for the example of smoking, people often will not develop lung cancer until 30 or 40 years after they started being exposed to that. So, with that long term thing in mind, it doesn't really like sink in or make people want to quit smoking. And then it's by the time they do realize it, it's too late. So carcinogens are kind of a slow moving process, and it's building up the concentration of these damaging materials in your body to a point where it damages your DNA. Your immune system, we've learned a lot about this more recently as we've been going through a pandemic. It's the cells and tissues inside your body that protect you from disease and harmful substances. And one of the most important things you can do for your immune system is get sleep. Um, Antibodies are things that attack alien invaders and mark them for attack from other immune cells. And then you have other things in there. Killer T cells are one that I can think of in specific examples that also kill invaders that come into your body. And like I said, getting sleep allows these antibodies and these other types of cells and that are part of your immune system to ramp up, to build up. They work better or they're produced most effectively while you're sleeping. Although they are happening when you're awake, they definitely, your immune system gets boosted a lot by sleep. Some chemicals, viruses, actually weaken the immune system and they leave it open to attack by invaders. So, for example, HIV, human immunodeficiency, or human immunodeficiency virus weakens the immune system. And so the immune system is unable to act upon other things that get inside your cells. So there's lots of things that can weaken your immune system as well, like stress, lack of sleep. If you don't get the right nutrients to help build those immune cells, that can also damage you. So zinc and vitamin C are some good things that you can do to boost your immune system. Pesticides are another example of something that can get into your body and weaken the immune system and its ability to attack foreign invaders. And here we are at our pit stop. I tried to mention a few of these things, but how can you support and strengthen your immune system? And this isn't mentioned in the written part of the notes, but what are some of the things that you can do to make your immune system strong and to help it attack and attack foreign invaders and prevent illness? Pause the video while you answer the question. Neurotoxins are another type of damaging substance that specifically damages the nervous system, your brain, spinal cord, and your nerves. And a lot of poisons are neurotoxins. Chlorinated hydrocarbons, you might recognize that term hydrocarbon from fossil fuels, but there's other types of substances that can be made from fossil fuels that have the same damaging effects. So DDT is an example of one of those. Organophosphate pesticides, that's one of the reasons why you might want to buy organic food is to avoid being exposed to these types of neurotoxins. Formaldehyde is one that we use, or we used to use as a preservative to keep things like in dissection labs and things, but it's also found in furniture to keep the wood fresh and sturdy. So formaldehyde is another thing that is a neurotoxin, and we've kind of phased it out of our product distribution. Heavy metals are neurotoxins. Some of them are industrial solvents, which are things that are used to break up difficult materials to clean. So, like oven cleaner, for example, is a neurotoxin. So, you definitely want to reduce your exposure to these materials. The endocrine system is the part of our body that produces hormones. We have certain glands that produce those hormones and parts in our brains as well. And hormones are just chemical messengers. So as a teenager, you often hear the words like, oh, it's just your hormones. But hormones are like in our body going all the time. It's just that they're changing a lot when you're a teenager. So hormones are just chemical messengers. They are put into the bloodstream at very low levels. Um, and they control things like sexual reproduction, growth, development, and then our behavior even is affected by the hormones that we have. Each hormone has a specific shape, which allows it to attach to certain cell receptors. So that's the chemical messaging part of it. And so it helps to keep cells in communication with one another. If you have a substance that acts like a hormone or that is shaped like a hormone, it can cause problems with your body. We call them hormone disruptors. Um, and that is in a class of category called hormonally active agents. So they can disrupt the chemical, or they can disrupt the normal function of your cells. And then there's also hormones that act like estrogen, which is found in both men and women, although it is more concentrated in women, which is why it's associated with women. But these hormones mimic estrogen and cause the harmful effects of them. You also have hormone blockers, which prevent natural hormones from attaching to the receptors. And so they prevent that chemical signaling. And there's actually a lot of hormone disruptors out there. And we even have things like birth control that gets into our waterways because women take birth control pills and then they urinate some of it out, and that doesn't always get filtered out in our water systems. I think Westerville actually has a really good water treatment system, so a lot of these things can be filtered out before they come to us, but not everywhere in the country has that high tax base to pay for really good water treatment. So I'm grateful that Westerville does that. Um, the effect of hormones can take place at very low levels. So it doesn't take a high dose, in order for a hormone or a hormone blocker or disruptor to have an effect. Thyroid problems are really common. I actually know in my immediate life 3 people that have thyroid problems. So again, this is stuff that can get into our bodies through our water systems. It can get through environmental pollution. So our endocrine systems are actually very susceptible to a lot of the chemicals that we have out in our environments. Hormonally active agents are also found in plastics. That's what the picture is here. But PCBs, I mentioned before, coming from hydrocarbons. Dioxins, again, are toxic substances we saw when we were looking at that table a few slides back. But plastics, especially if you leave plastic in water, or I'm sorry, plastic, like a plastic water bottle in the sun, the plastic will leach into the water, and that gives you some hormonally active agents in your body. Pesticides also, we mentioned a few of those, that organophosphate pesticides that have that hormonal influence. And then lead as well. So, how much do we know about the chemicals that we have out there? Um, of the 75,000 chemicals in use today, only about 10% have been screened for toxicity, and only 2% have been tested to see if they are mutagens or carcinogens, teratogens. So, a very small percentage has actually been tested. And this is really not a good thing because I don't know about you, but most of the time when I'm shopping and I see something on the shelf, I just assume, oh, if it's being sold, it's safe. About every year, about 1,000 new chemicals come onto the market, and most of those chemicals are not tested. Again, only 10% are. So 99.5% of commercial use chemicals are not regulated by any sort of government. So this is one of the problems with assuming that your products are safe, because they may or may not be. They are not required to be by the government, so they may not spend the money to assure you that they are not toxic. Really, we should be focused more on preventing the harm from toxic chemicals and substances, and we don't really know the effects of these things. So why do we still have them so widely used and available to us? Part of the reason is that under our present laws, chemicals are considered innocent until proven guilty, much like people are considered innocent until proven guilty, or they are considered. Um, Chemical industries actually fight very hard, or companies in the chemical industry actually fight really hard to prevent regulation. I have the symbol for the American Chemistry Council, which is a lobbying organization that lobbies Congress people, or basically pays them. Bribes them, if you will, so that they don't pass laws that will regulate chemical safety. And so, unfortunately, that's the way our political system is. So, unless people either do their own independent research or try to get the word out about harmful chemicals, really, there's not a whole lot that we can do. There is an app that you're going to do an assignment with this week called it's called Think Dirty app, and you can scan products and it will tell you the chemicals that are in it and their relative harm. So that is going to be a cool assignment for you to kind of see, like, what are the harmful products that you might already be using. All right, so that gets to our next pit stop here. Who is responsible for informing the public about the potential toxicity of chemicals in consumer products? So I give a multiple choice option here. Pause the video while you respond to this question. All right, let's move on to our last hazard type, biological hazards. And those are diseases that could be either transmissible or non transmissible. A non transmissible disease is not caused by a living organism, it's not moved from one person to the next or one organism to the next. Things like malnutrition, emphysema, bronchitis, cardiovascular disease, or heart disease, those things are not transmitted by a pathogen. Transmissible disease is caused by a living organism or a virus, and it can be spread from person to person. You do need to know what a pathogen is. A pathogen is an infectious agent. So that could be a bacteria or a virus, just something that infects a person and causes disease. The vector is another term that you need to know. A vector is just an insect or a non human carrier of disease. A mosquito is a very famous vector. You also hear about bats being another a vector, at least in the case of the coronavirus. But there's lots of different vectors out there that carry a disease from one organism to another. And those carriers may or may not be affected by that pathogen. It's just when they get it into a host that pathogen causes problems. So, what affects the spread of disease? Migration into urban areas. So, we have a greater population density, like you see in this picture. That's why the coronavirus spreads so quickly in urban communities first, because the population density is greater. Um, our reduction of biodiversity actually reduces the species that control vectors. So I'm showing bats here, not because they are a vector, but because they actually help to control mosquito populations. And so if you wipe out a habitat for bats, or if you kill bats because you think that they're a vector, you could actually be allowing mosquitoes to grow out of control. So there's lots of reasons to keep biodiversity, but this is just another one. We have increased our cultivation of rice as the human population has grown, and that causes mosquito populations to increase because for rice you need bogs of standing water. So that has contributed. And then we also have an increase in international air travel. It is really great to travel and to see the world, but it also helps us to bring pathogens from one location to another, not just in humans, but in other living species that hitch a ride in our international travel. Other things that affect the spread of disease, climate change, because warmer regions are better for vectors. If you look here, this is a malaria regional chart. So this is where there's currently malaria common in the yellow areas. And then the red are the ones that are areas that are increasing or likely to increase because of climate change, because mosquitoes can survive, or the specific types of mosquitoes can survive in those areas. Natural disasters like floods can cause disease to spread, especially waterborne pathogens. And then some bacteria are becoming resistant to antibiotics. If you look at this petri dish here, this is actually kind of like an experiment I did in my evolution class in college. And you're basically creating antibiotic resistance. So you put this pill in here, and then you just swab here for some of the bacteria that survived, and you put them over here, and then you put another antibiotic there, and some more will survive, and then you put it right there, and some more will survive. And so eventually this antibiotic does not work on this bacteria at all. And that's how antibiotic resistant works. It's basically causing evolution in these bacteria to happen really quickly, and so our antibiotics are no longer effective. You also have virus strains of influenza that may develop, or other viruses, as we have seen, can develop and spread across the world. And then there's also the fear of bioterrorism. So this would be using pathogens to kill other people. The best historical example I can think of is when the English gave smallpox blankets to Native Americans, and that those Native Americans didn't have any sort of immune buildup for that, and so it wiped them out. So bioterrorism is a real threat, especially considering the various types of pathogens that are out there. All right, so here's our, I believe, last pit stop. What is the difference between a pathogen and a vector? Pause the video while you answer the question. All right, let's talk about risk analysis. So getting back to that risk management, risk assessment area. Again, you need to start by identifying a hazard. That generally happens on its own. But the risk assessment is just evaluating the associated risk with a certain hazard. You can do a comparative risk analysis where you're ranking the risk, like what is more of a risk, the risk to the economy or the risk to public health. Um, then there's risk communication, making the public aware of the risks and the relative harm that can come from each. Poverty is actually the greatest risk that people face um, throughout the world. So a lot of us don't often think about that, but people who live in poverty are often have much worse health outcomes than those who do not. And so there's all sorts of different public health issues associated with poverty. They're exposed to more environmental stress, more stress in general, the stress of living and making ends meet, and they may not get enough nutrition. So poverty really is the biggest human risk that we face in the world. And just an interesting chart to show you here. What do people worry about around the world? And so in the United States, we are here. First of all, this bar graph is showing the percent of respondents who say their country is on the wrong track. So France is really unhappy with their government. So is Mexico. We're at about a little over 60%. And terrorism was the biggest problem that people were afraid of. But you can see other places. Poverty and inequality is an issue, healthcare, unemployment, financial and political corruption. So it really varies depending on where you live. And this is from 2016. So just an interesting comparison of the different ways that people think that they're endangered or threatened. And this is actually showing, this is another interesting perspective piece. This shows what actually causes people to die. So heart and circulatory disorders are the biggest cause of death. Cancer is another big chunk, and respiratory disorders. So just these three alone are enormous. And then you get to nervous system disorders, kidney disorders, all the way down to like transport accidents. So here's car accidents, mental health disorder, murder, medical complications, pregnancy, and then war is actually a lot smaller than you would think it is, although war is a pretty ugly way to experience death. So it gives you some perspective there. So go ahead and read through all of your notes again. This is a big section with a lot of ideas, but just write a 7 sentence summary about the major ideas. And once again, here is our superhero of the coronavirus, Dr. Anthony Fauci, giving you the thumbs up.